Hello and welcome to Forgotten Fronts. I am Jeremy, and in today's episode we'll be playing the mission Not a Bullet is Molded It, which is to kill me. But first, an essay? If you don't want to hear this piece, a time will come up on your screen. Wait for it. Now! Francis Barlow lost the town of Gettysburg on the first day of the fighting due to his nativist sentiments and poor command. Barlow's division consisted of two brigades, one of them Yankees under Albert Ames, and the other one made up of immigrants from Central and Eastern Europe, most notably Germany under Leopold von Gilsa, many of them fleeing the failed 1848 revolutions and settling in the USA, called the Pennsylvania Deutsch, or Dutch. Barlow accepted the story spread by the rest of the army and the press that, quote, the whole failure of the Army of the Potomac was due to its scandalous poltroonery, end quote, talking about the 11th Corps, where most of the German-American immigrants went, and as a result disliked his Dutch brigade, only helping him to emphasize his disciplinarianism towards them. Barlow was known to have a cavalry saber at his side, as when he hit a straggler, he wanted it to hurt. Another example of his disciplinarianism is when the division advanced on the field of Gettysburg, he arrested von Gilsa and the leader of the 17th Connecticut for allowing more than one man to get water at the same time. Thankfully, Scourge released these two men as he didn't want the division to go into battle without two of its officers. When the 11th Corps arrived on the field of Gettysburg, they deployed along a tributary by the county almshouse with three of their divisions, leaving one in reserve on Cemetery Hill. In front of the county almshouse ran 22 fence lines on Blockers Run. The Germans of the Corps wanted to break their reputation from Chancellorsville, as they were the first hit by Jackson's flanking attack, and in their current position might have held against a Confederate attack, blasting them with cannon and musketry as they were slowed and tired climbing over the fence and wading through the streams. However, around 3 p.m., Barlow's other trait showed itself, his aggressiveness, as he moved his division up to take the Knoll. Much like Sickles in the Peach Orchard on Day 2, to capture the only feature on the ground, though it would isolate his division. And much like Sickles, Barlow was also more a lawyer than a professional soldier. Barlow deployed his division on the Knoll with von Gilsa's brigade directly on the Knoll, and Ames's brigade in reserve. Barlow hoped to use his better brigade to attack Dole's exposed flank. The only unit that was moved up to support von Gilsa's was Wilkinson's brigade, whom Barlow ordered up without Osborne's orders. Despite being on ground that Barlow considered better, von Gilsa's brigade was exposed to rebel artillery farther up the Harrisburg Road. Their left flank was also exposed, and they could not see to their front due to the trees that lined Blockers Run. Barlow probably moved up his division with permission from Otis Howard, his corps commander, then temporary army commander. Barlow's attention was firmly fixed on the attack on Oak Hill. It was only when Buford's cavalry came down the Harrisburg Road and reported a large amount of rebels moving down the road that he knew he would be under attack, but by then it would be too late to withdraw his brigade. His advance not only exposed his division to be easily destroyed, but also stretched George Van Amsberg's brigade into a heavy skirmish line while trying to support John C. Robinson's flank, and exposed the center of the almshouse line. But eventually the rebels attacked, and after heavy fighting, von Gilsa was pushed back and Ames was moved into support, but the retreating unit slowed them down and disorganized them to be easily surrounded and pushed back as well. Then the same thing happened to Sheshanowski's brigade, and when his flank was exposed, George von Amsberg was forced to retreat. In conclusion, Barlow and his troops had a mutual distrust and dislike of each other, which sapped their morale, which only helped Barlow to employ his disciplinary nature, which only helped the morale to be sapped further. Barlow's advance to the Knoll also weakened the Union line, stretching it to skirmish lines to be easily broken by the rebel charge. And finally, Barlow only deployed von Gilsa's brigade onto the Knoll itself, keeping Ames in reserve, though in theory his better brigade could push back Dole's brigade, and when von Gilsa's brigade broke, he could throw the blame onto them and easily counterattack with Ames's brigade, helping to perpetuate the myth that he already believed. The battlefield was eerily silent except for the banners of the men of the 11th Corps flapping in the wind as the Confederate attack had stalled at McPherson's Ridge. Bringing his field glasses to his eyes and looking in disbelief at Barlow's division exposed and isolated on Blockers Knoll, Major Carl Schurz muttered to himself, "He has misunderstood my order or has been carried away by the ardor of this conflict." Summoning a courier, then sending it galloping off to Colonel George von Amsberg, ordering him to hold his position and, if possible, to support the 1st Corps on Oak Hill. On the other side of the field, Brigadier General Albert Ames consolidates his brigade into columns on the south side of Blockers Knoll. However, Brigadier General Francis Barlow arrives the other side of the crest and halts him, taking personal command of his brigade, ordering his brigade to remain where they were and to support his left flank. Then a worried courier rides up to Schurz, his horse hooves kicking up puffs of dust, giving him a dispatch from Major General Howard. As the dust clears, Schurz takes the dispatch from the man and wipes his spectacles and begins to read, his face creasing into a concerned frown as he finishes it. On Blockers Knoll, Barlow takes command of Colonel Leopold von Gilsa's brigade, thinking to himself that he'd be damned if he let those damn Dutch lose his engagement and drag his reputation through the mud. Then, taking command of the 4th U.S. Artillery Battery G, he scanned his position around the knoll with his field glasses for where he should place his new guns. Down the road from the Knoll, the town of Gettysburg held its breath, many of its citizens having fled or taken cover in their root cellars as the church bell continued to ring an alarm to those who ignored its warning before. Howard, looking through his field glasses on his position on Cemetery Hill, saw that the almshouse line was broken by Barlow's division, and so he heeds the request of support from Schurz and orders Colonel Charles Custer's brigade off Cemetery Hill to block the bridge that was blocked by Barlow's division earlier that afternoon. Another courier gallops across the field to Schurz, kicking up great clods of earth. When the courier arrives, he gives Schurz a dispatch from Barlow, requesting reinforcements from Sheshanowski's brigade, as reports from Buford's cavalry reported large rebel movements to the north of the Knoll. The courier then asked, "What are your orders, sir?" Howard sighed, noting how long it would take for Sheshanowski's brigade to arrive to the Knoll, and said to the courier, "I can only give General Barlow my best wishes." And then the courier thundered off once again. In the meantime, Custer's brigade marched down the Harrisburg Road, kicking up large clouds of dust that covered their blue uniforms as their standard flew proudly in the breeze. As they marched, their fife and drum played some distance from Prussia. Then the breath that seemed to be held by all was released suddenly and sharply as the artillery on Oak Hill and Oak Ridge thundered. Gray-black smoke blossomed from the guns on the ridge as the rebels commenced their attack. With all this disturbing news coming in, Schurz looked to the Knoll through his field glasses, where Barlow reformed von Gilsa's brigade from a heavy skirmish line into a line of battle along the run. First giving his orders in English, then von Gilsa repeated them in German, as squirrels along the run chittered unhappily and birds flew off calling out warnings. Barlow then sent a courier to Ames, telling him that he detached the 25th Ohio to hold his right flank. The regiment moved in columns and fours, advancing to the bridge. No fife and drum was played, so not to give their position away to the rebels. However, the men still craned their necks to attempt to see the rebels. However, they saw nothing, but their minds quickly created gray shadows skulking in the fields. The Hiram-Burney rifles were sent farther down the fence line in the meantime, hoping to get the best field of fire along the Knoll. Most controversially, Barlow moved his cannons of the Battery G in between the line regiments to blast the rebels with canister. As the final defensive preparations were put to place on the Knoll, another courier rode up to Schurz from Alexander Scheffelfennig. The dispatch complained that Barlow advanced too far, which stretched their line, which was already threatened by the attack on Oak Ridge. "Your orders, sir?" said the courier. "Tell Scheffelfennig with my compliments to hold their position, and if attacked with overwhelming force, to fall back to the almshouse line." The courier then gave a quick salute and rode away with his orders. Seeing the open ground on his right flank, Scheffelfennig moved the 13th New York Independent Battery to support Barlow's flank and to halt the rebel brigade from attacking across Blocker's Run. The artillery had already sighted in their shot and began to fire out clouds of smoke shrouding the guns. Then the courier arrives from Scheffelfennig and the gunners hitch up their heavy guns to the artillery train. Behind the Knoll, Ames orders his brigade into columns to quickly reinforce the Knoll where needed. This time he was able to accomplish this order as Barlow was too busy moving his other regiments and guns around the Knoll. As soon as his brigade began to move, the rebels began their flanking attack on the Knoll. The 74th Pennsylvania Bugler sounded the formed battle line and advanced, and the regiment was ordered forward to take cover along the fences to block the crossing to the Carlisle Road. The officer yelled to his men, "Make sure you're loaded and await my command!" Seeing that the artillery was advancing unsupported, the 2nd Hecker Regiment moves in columns of fours to the other side of the Carlisle Road to support them. At the same time, the Rebel Brigade attacked the flank of the Knoll. Another brigade attacked across Blocker's Run. These movements were firm and steady as usual, their banners bearing the blue Southern Cross flaunted impudently and seemed to challenge combat. Some of the men along the line quickly inoculated themselves against the risk of battle with schnapps in their canteen. The artillerymen lined up their pieces on them, loaded with shell shot. The gunners and nearby infantry, hearts beat in anticipation, making final checks on their rifles and artillery. The 153rd Pennsylvania prepared for battle by turning their line to face on the oncoming rebels, steadying their rifles on the fence, grim looks of determination on their faces. Their officers yelled to their men while lifting his kepi in his hand, "Männer, the fight is going to start soon and your enlistment had all expired. Who will stand and fight with me?" And his men cheered, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, swearing never to run again. The short speech was punctuated by explosions from the nearby cannon, which flew back like runaway trains. This was shortly followed by a volley of musketry on the advancing greybacks as muzzle flames stabbed through the smoke, the mini balls tearing cloth and flesh alike as the rebels continued their advance. The 2nd German Rifles wheeled right to face the oncoming rebels, rushing to support the 2 cannon. The gunners were grateful for the support, if annoyed that the infantry blocked the ammunition caissons. As the rifles rushed into position, the rebels crossed the run under heavy fire, looking for a place to cross as the grape and ball snarled by. "Forward, men! No stand for the wounded! Any man can't stand Barlow raised his field glasses to his eyes, for his leather strap dangling around his neck. Looking over the run, he was surprised the damn Dutch still held. Then looking over to his left flank, he saw another thing that surprised him, a rebel brigade moving in to attack his flank. Without skipping a beat, he quickly galloped to Ames, ordering him to move some of his brigade to check this flanking movement. Ames raised his sword and yelled to his men, "Now, men, drive those rebels back across the run! Double quick, support the guns!" And ordered the 107th Ohio to support the cannon on the left flank of the Knoll. The regiment wheeled their column to the left and moved at the double to the exposed gun, previously supported by the 2nd German Rifles. The next were the 75th Ohio, who followed suit on the other side of the same gun. Around the same moment, the 13th New York Independent Battery reaching their position, the gunners rushing forward to move the snake rail fence to make way for the guns. At the same moment, the officer of the 74th Pennsylvania saw a regiment of graybacks attempting to flank around the Knoll through the cornfield, trampling the corn, following their dusty, sun-bleached, and torn flag. A grayback officer follows them, his hat in hand, yelling, "Press on! Press on! No stop until dark!" On the Knoll, the two regiments formed their columns into line under a considerable fire. Bullets flew overhead, sounding like ripping canvas. The regiment was eager to return it in revenge for Chancellorsville, unleashing a volley, surrounding them in a veil of rifle smoke. Barlow looked on this, satisfied that his Yankee brigade, led by the former leader of the 20th Maine, could easily hold back the gray tide. Turning in his saddle to the right flank, he saw the men of the 25th Ohio also forming into line, though under significantly less duress than those on the left. This encouraged a nearby gun to unlimber and open fire on the nearby rebel regiments. Then another grayback regiment advances into the cornfield, the rebel regiment trampling cornstalks as they advanced to the beat of the drum under shell fire which screeched overhead. A man was eviscerated in a column of flame as a shell impacted. The 107th Ohio wheeled right, firing on the new grayback threat through the orchard. Rifles crackled angrily and a volley ripped into the southern attackers. However, they advanced too far while attempting to take the battery, in doing so becoming isolated. The 2nd Hecker Regiment moved up to support the battery. Old Glory, tattered and stained, waved in the breeze. Then in a surprising turn of events, the rebel regiment turned to open fire on the troops on the Knoll, opening their rear to be fired upon by the battery and nearby regiments. On Cemetery Hill, Howard, looking through his field glasses out, seeing that the Knoll was under severe pressure, the wind blowing towards the hill, carrying with it the reek of smoke and blood, Howard clenched his fist hard and then released it, where other men would have sworn and blasphemed at his disobedient subordinate. Then he summoned a courier, after writing a dispatch sending him to Brigadier General Adolf von Steinwehr to send the rest of his division down the hill to the almshouse line to shore up the center. Then the courier rides off to the brigadier, kicking up small puffs of dirt in the air. On the Knoll, the Union and Confederate were only 75 yards apart, and the names of the battle flags printed on the flags might have been read had there been time to read them. The 17th Connecticut rushed up to the left of the 107th Ohio to put more pressure on the rebels' regiments in the cornfield. Rifles flamed and smoked, ramrods rattled and scraped in the hot barrels as the men continued their fusillade. As the cannon belched canister, cutting bloody gaps in the advancing rebel units who were the file closures immediately closed. The graybacks then rushed forth another regiment through the cornfield to attack the battery, their yells like scrabbling wild beasts' howls. As they advanced, they received enfilade fire from the 74th Pennsylvania, which halted the rebels who turned to fire on them. This opened their flank to the 2nd Hecker Regiment, who moved up to pour flanking fire on them. The 17th Connecticut, despite being under heavy fire, rushed up to the fence, only now forming line. The terrible roar of battle surrounded the Knoll, as did the sulphuric smoke, fumes thick and acrid. One could hardly see the man next to him. The casualties were terrible, oh so many killed and wounded, calling out for water and struggling to the rear. Our regiments poured volley and canister down on the advancing rebels, who clawed up the muddy bank, few finding success, only to be shot rolling down the hill covered in mud and blood. A rebel color bearer came up the bank, screaming like an Indian. The men did not shoot him, preferring the ones with rifles, until a man missed, and he rolled down the hill wrapped in the muddy banner. The trees wreathed in smoke were scarred with the passing Minnie balls as a lasting reminder of the battle. To the left flank of the Knoll, 2 greyback regiments that attempted to attack the battery were surrounded in the cornfield, and within a few minutes the ground was covered in arms, bodies, and pools of blood and viscera. The torture cries of the wounded penetrated the continuous bedlam of musketry, all the while their officer attempted to rally them. The Confederate attack thus far had achieved little other than to raise their casualties on them, one of them saying after the battlefield, "I think they fight harder in their own country. I'd rather fight them in Virginia." Bullets hummed overhead like infuriated bees as men frantically reloaded their rifles and muskets. In the cornfield, the Confederate officers even picked up muskets, one turning to one of his soldiers asking for a cartridge, only for the nearest man to clutch his chest and yell, "Oh God, help me!" and collapse into the ground, coughing up gobs of blood and said, "I'm gone! Leave me here." Then, however, one of the guns on the Knoll fell back, subject to a concentrated fire of which no battery could stand. Almost at first fire, the commander was mortally wounded, hit in the leg, necessitating it be amputated. To the right flank of the position, a whole fresh rebel brigade bore down on the 2 small regiments and cannon, who could not see them through the gun smoke, flame, and chaos which surrounded the run. Things went well on the other flank, however, as 2 regiments were raked with rifle, musket, and cannon fire. The field was soon covered in blood-splattered dead and wounded. Along the run, smoke was caught up in the trees, suffocating the men who sweat in the intense heat. Sweat dribbled from the men's beard as the wounded begged for water. The rebels muddied their uniform fronts, trying to climb up the wet banks, struggling to keep their powder dry. Their men lined up on the bank, the mud helping them to blend in, using it as cover, returning fire on our infantry. Scenes like this played along the run as the Confederate attack ground to a halt. We advanced with our accustomed yell, but they stood firm. They were harder to drive than we'd ever known them. Men were being mowed down in great numbers on both sides. The men surrounding the field, though with thin ranks and ghastly wounds, still held despite their desperate circumstances. Blasted with canister fire and rifle shot fizzing around their heads, the bullets making wet thuds followed by screams and curses as they made contact. But the pressure was starting to show as the 107th Ohio began to fall back from its position. Von Gilsa saw this and galloped over to them and was able to rally them, yelling to them, "Men, remember that your oaths! Never another Chancellorsville!" To push back the defiant rebel regiment, Barlow ordered 2 more cannon forward to blast them back with canister fire. The victim of canister were unrecognizable, fly-ridden masses of jagged bones, blue guts, torn flesh, and uniform scraps. But then on the right flank, the inevitable happened as a fresh rebel brigade advanced and attacked von Gilsa's exposed flank. "Mein Gott, there are thousands of them! Come back, you coward! Männer, remember your promise! Never another Chancellorsville! Do not condemn yourself to the same fate as that coward!" Quickly looking through his field glasses and wiping them from a thin layer of gunpowder, Barlow summons a courier and quickly scribbles a desperate dispatch and sends it with the fastest courier to Schurz for reinforcement. As soon as the dispatch arrives, Schurz sends a courier to Scheffelfenning to begin to move his troops to the almshouse line. Scheffelfenning then orders the 1st Ohio Light Battery I to withdraw to the almshouse line on the road to support its left flank. The gunners grumble as they hit their great guns to limbers, relieved that they are taken away from the fray. Seeing the battery withdraw, Colonel Vladimir Shashanowski and Colonel Charles R. Koster form battle line along the fences by the almshouse. They advance with good style, sun glinting off their belt buckles, buttons, and bayonets. As they move into position, Colonel Orland Smith's brigade and the batteries of Captain Lewis Heckman and Captain Michael Wiedring arrive from Cemetery Hill, waving Old Glory, its stripes rippling in the wind. The last of the people of the town of Gettysburg cheering them on as the roar of battle draws nearer and nearer, and more eyes are drawn away looking at it in concern before going to shelter once again. On the left flank, Dilger halts his battery for a moment as the original route would have put his battery in front of the protective skirmish line, so he orders his battery to move on a more direct route to the almshouse line. Von Armsburg looks to the center of the 11th Corps line through his field glasses. Seeing that there are no Confederates there, he moved the 61st Ohio along the fence line where the Confederates attacked the 74th Pennsylvania skirmish line. White powder smoke blossomed from the skirmish line's loose scattered formation, pouring accurate fire into the massed Confederate ranks from the groups of 2 men along the fence line, covering the other, delaying the Confederate attackers while the guns withdraw. Von Armsburg hopes his troops would stop the Confederates from attacking Barlow's already exposed left flank until he was able to pull his division back from the Knoll. On the Knoll, wreathed in smoke, the Dutch gave the Greybacks a bloody nose as one of the surrounding Greyback regiments was pushed back by such concentrated fire it was a marvel that any escaped. Missiles howled overhead as bullets cracked, the dead covered in rivulets of blood as flies descended upon them. However, the rebels swiped back, pushing back 2 of our regiments in our center. An officer waved his men with his sword, then stopped, turning around with his mouth wide open, his eyes wide, shaking in disbelief as he sank to his knees, his mouth distorting into a scream. One of the final guns of Lieutenant Bayard Wilkinson's battery moved to halt the advancing rebels, loading and firing double canister at remarkable speed. On the left flank of the line, the other Greyback regiment was pushed back, at a heavy cost to the battery, who had all but withdrawn. In a feeble attempt to stabilize the line, Barlow orders the 2nd Hecker Regiment to the center of the knoll. The officer yelled to his men, "Forward, men! Remember your oaths!" His sword in the air, and his face black with blood and dirt. At the same time, the 17th Connecticut capitalized on their success, advancing on the flank of the Greybacks across the run. Men jeered at the withdrawing Greybacks. "Enjoy your licking, boys! Don't worry, we're right behind you!" Not knowing that the right flank had collapsed. The 74th Pennsylvania also ordered to the center of the knoll, though the officer protested that this exposed their left flank and soon stopped. As the two regiments run past on the fly, backpacks held above their head to protect them, an officer managed to rally some of the men, except the small group stood little chance against the flood of fear that swept the majority away. On the almshouse line, the two brigades ordered their men to take cover along the fence, along the run. The men feeling a heady mix of fear and excitement, the men looked forward bitterly at the disaster on their knoll, the mouths dry, hearts erratic and bladders full, checking their equipment and making short prayers. The men formed small groups in the grooves of the snake rail fence, moving their cartridge boxes to the front of their belts to make loading easier. To their front, two large crowds of fugitive infantry passed through the orchard by the almshouse. The men seeing this, hearts sink. Wounded men staggered from the trees by the almshouse. Some of the injured were helped by friends. Others crawled or limped painfully back. Many of the men were not wounded at all, but all were frightened of the Confederate advance. The men of Smith's brigade emerged from the town, and he orders them to form a double line in the center of the almshouse line. On the knoll, the cannon were pushed back, their wagons chipped with mini balls. However, the 82nd Illinois moved to take cover along the fence along the crest of the knoll. Their commander stood up and smoked his cigar, facing the mini balls with a schadenfreude of a Saladin. Barlow then ordered the final guns of Battery G back to the reverse side of the knoll in a desperate attempt to save them from capture. On the left flank, one of the Greyback regiments were under a lively fire of mini balls and explosive shells, and the scorched remained of the cornfield, watered well with their blood. The 74th Pennsylvania marches on the rebel rear to the steady beat of a drum. Then a courier thunders up to Dilger, saluting quickly, and the independent battery is ordered to fall back along the road by the almshouse line. As the two regiments return to the rear like pigeons, splashing across the run, discarding or soaking their cartridge boxes. In the field on the left flank of the knoll, the Greybacks charge the 17th Connecticut, and a wild melee breaks out. At the same time, the independent battery had fallen back and withdrawn to the almshouse line along the road. We withstood an enemy more than 3 times our number, receiving volleys in rapid succession and suffering severely, their almost feral howls surrounding us and drawing ever nearer. The Hiram Burney rifles are surrounded on 3 sides but barely hold their position. The roar of rifles deafen them and the powder smoke overwhelms their sense of smell. As the 82nd Illinois moves into place, Ames is ordered to the rear to attempt to rally the retreating soldiers. Around the same time, von Gilsa is also pulled back behind the crest of the knoll. With the withdrawal of their cannon and the brigadier generals, the infantry is slowly withdrawn, all under the direction of Barlow, who stayed behind to command the withdrawal personally. The brigadier looked calmly forward while his horse showed what he truly felt, stamping its hooves and tossing his head nervously, sleek with sweat and rolling its eyes white. The first were the 2nd German Rifles, who were earnestly engaged by 2 or more rebel regiments, causing sad havoc among the Union infantry. When the rebel infantry advanced on them, they were ordered to retreat. The 17th Connecticut broke away from the rebel regiment and ran in fear. The rebels pursued, their officer yelling to his men, "Hot and fast, men! Scare the daylights out of them!" His men responded with a blood-chilling yelp of the rebels, rushing forward. On our extreme left flank, von Armsburg's skirmers line begins to fall back as the Confederate brigade attacks, balls whistling overhead. Earlier receiving the dispatch on the situation on the knoll, von Armsburg forms up his brigade and withdraws to the almshouse line, except for one who acts as a rearguard. The Union brigade withdraws to rebel gunfire and jeers, the first rank disappearing in smoke and sparks, from which came the clatter of metal ramrods on barrel. By now, the situation on the knoll had broke down into chaos as all the regiments broke, and Barlow finally withdrew. Schurz did likewise moments later as shells screeched overhead. A regiment ran through the almshouse line. Nearby officers called to them in German, Polish, and a slew of other Central and Eastern European languages in an attempt to stop them affecting the men, but they did not respond as this regiment was from the 2nd Corps. Now that the brigade has escaped, the 61st Ohio pulled back and now begins to make its way to the almshouse line. The ammunition wagons also begin to make their way to the almshouse line, where the Corps was to make its final stand. On the Knoll, all units were falling back in various degrees of organization. Some broke into utter chaos, while others formed rough columns and halted where they could to fire on the advancing rebels. The rebels quickly occupied the Knoll, and some stayed to hold up while others chased the fugitive units as carrion birds begin to descend around the Knoll. Von Gilson withdraws behind the almshouse line to rally his brigade. Barlow gallops up to a supply wagon, ordering them back before galloping past the almshouse line. The artillery batteries on the almshouse line began to unlimber their guns and line up their shots on the rebels. Ames also rallies and reinforces his brigade on the crossroad. Smith's brigade ascends along the center of the almshouse line. The 33rd Massachusetts and the 53rd Ohio form along the fence by the almshouse itself, while the 73rd Ohio reinforces the center as the ironclads move into reserve. All the while, the shattered remains of regiments attempt to stream through our line, pleading to the others to turn tail as the situation was hopeless. While on the Knoll, the 75th Ohio was left behind in the smoking confusion, surrounded by the rebels. Metallic clattering of ramrods rammed bullets hard onto powder charges, fingers stained black with gunpowder, pushing brass percussion caps onto fire-darkened cones. Shells wailed overhead, whipping branches back and forth, showering leaves on the soldiers, then landing, throwing dirt and iron through the air as they explode. Several times we were not but 50 yards apart. Twice the rebels fixed bayonets, and we thought we were going to meet them hand to hand. But we raised a great shout and rushed forward, firing a volley and pushing them back, fighting all the time. The desperate sound of the Ohioans was broken as bullets cut through the air. The bugler began to sound the retreat when a bullet pierced his throat to the bone, and the bugle sounded like a startled elephant. Wilkinson set up his 2 remaining guns to support the withdrawing Union forces. His guns blow a smoke and flame at the rebels on the Knoll. Distance explosions rip apart the rebels. They then quickly limber up as the rebels pour over the Knoll, and the battery rushes to the almshouse line. The almshouse line at the time was a very definition of chaos, as regiments, organized or not, fell back or took up position along the fence. Von Armsburg's men struggled to get around the left flank of the line as the regiments refused passage through their ranks as they feared disorganization. Dilger's battery moves forward in the field of the Kitzman's farm for a better spot to sight in their guns on the advancing Grey Horde, appearing like wolf packs on the timberline. In the center of the almshouse line, fugitives blocked the way for the regiments to form a cohesive line. This caused Ames and von Gilson to make more rallying cries as they moved the remnants of their brigades to the crossroads. As the regiments move into position, von Armsburg's brigade is posted to the right of the line. The gaps in our line which the fugitives slipped through begin to close as regiments begin to wheel about to face the oncoming Confederates. Wilkinson's guns are posted next to Heckman's guns to form a mass battery on the high ground by the Crawford farm. A mighty thunder is then unleashed by the artillery along the almshouse line as it opened fire. Dilger personally aimed the first of his cannon to fire, and the ball screeched across the field, then tore off the head of a rebel regiment commander. Finally, Howard sends a courier to Barlow to withdraw his division back to Cemetery Hill to rest. Von Armsburg's brigade is ordered to form in the middle of the line to go behind the line to leave an open area to fire. Any regiment that took part in the fighting on the Knoll was then ordered to the crossroad by the nearest officers. As the rebels come into view, the regiments turn to face them, closing the gap in our center and pulling their hammers to full cock, a look of nervousness and determination on the men's faces. The regiments began to wheel, starting with Costa's brigade on our right, all the way to the left, though the rebel attack seemed to be focused on Smith's brigade in our center. Then suddenly Smith's horse reared, and he drew his sword, which scraped in its scabbard. Then he ordered his brigade to attack the unorganized Confederates. Scourge, seeing this, quickly rode up, bellowing for him to stop. Losing one division was bad enough due to poor leadership and maneuver, so Scourge put Smith in a charge and took command of his brigade personally. He quickly moved his men back along the fences, and a rebel yell was faintly heard, followed by a clatter of rifle fire, the beginning of another hail of lead.
There they are, boys! Let's have at 'em! Forward! 9! What are you doing?
Scourge, seeing this, quickly rode up, bellowing for him to stop. Losing one division was bad enough due to poor leadership and maneuver, and so Scourge put Smith in a charge and took command of his brigade personally. This sudden change in order so quickly delivered caused no small amount of chaos among the brigade. Not helped that at the same time Von Armsburg's brigade moved into reserve in the rear. At the same time, the grey and buttered up masses advanced, screaming their high-pitched screech under their blood-red banners. All the while, the great guns of the artillery let loose all manner of shell into the advancing mass. Schaffelfenning quickly moved his men back along the fences as a rebel yell was faintly heard, followed by a clatter of rifle fire, beginning another hail of lead. Schaffelfenning then ordered two of his regiments to a fence line along the run's edge to halt and fire a volley, but the men refused to move any further, and the officers attempt to rally them to obey them rather than their fears. The Confederates rushed a regiment to the bridge, exposing the flank of the 33rd Massachusetts. The 5th German Rifles quickly filled the gap in the line, moving their column into line. Opening such a devastating fire on the rebels that they began to lose cohesion, one rebel saying after the battle,
"The Yankees fought more stubbornly than I ever saw them or ever want to see them again."
Then the 33rd Massachusetts rushed up to the fence post as bullets hissed overhead, only briefly staggering when the rebels returned fire. As the men arrived at the fence line, they could see the result of their volley, a pile of still writhing broken bodies. A man staggered back from the fighting, bare-chested, suspenders hung by his legs, clutching his belly, trying to keep his guts from falling into the dust, his arms soaked in blood. Then the whole weight of their fire poured into the rebel regiment in the orchard as the rebels began to look worried as they were unsupported, their fellow regiments organizing themselves behind the orchard. Two of the rebel commanders rushed up to the two attacking regiments to rally them. Then our artillery suddenly thundered all at once, smoke jutting from the gun barrels obscuring them. Dilger, the Prussian-trained battery commander, coordinated this barrage. Looking through his telescope, scanning the grey mass, ordered his men to put in longer fuses as many of the shells exploded in black smoke overhead, raining deadly shell fragments among them. Then the rebels began to advance once again, yelling their foul, high-pitched yell. At the same time, von Arnsberg's brigade forms in the center in columns to reinforce the line where needed. By the bridge, a rebel regiment took intense fire as they took cover in the bank. Their commander rode along the bank, almost ignorant of the air thick with lead. The two rebel regiments that advanced rushed into the tributary and barely slowed, crossing over the fence and splashing across the run, screaming their almost feral yell. Their yell was answered by the men of the 33rd, who with bayonets fixed, fired a volley and then rushed in after them.
Now, 33rd, to your duty! Double quick charge bayonets! Drive those bastards across the stream!
The two regiments charged towards each other with bayonets, rifle butts, and bowie knives, the two different war cries colliding to become one. The men struggle in the now red run. A private fires a close-range shot with buck and ball, and the rebel's face disappears in a red mist and collapses without knowing what hit him, barely reaching up. A rebel closed on one of our privates, smashing him in the throat with his rifle butt, then hitting the man in the face with a sickening crunch. The man gripped his face with both hands, blood seeping between his fingers. A Bay State officer slashed a rebel's belly, and he attempted to keep his guts in as he fell with a high-pitched scream. The ironclads rushed up behind the melee to support the battery if the Bay Staters were pushed back. Most of them turned away from the melee, retching at the sight of such barbarity. As blades slash and men scream, another rebel regiment charges the 55th Ohio with their high-pitched battle cries. Eventually, the 33rd Massachusetts beat back the rebel regiment, some of the men quickly smashing the rebels and dragged back the stunned men as prisoners. Then suddenly, the whole regiment split in two. Some of the men surrendered and walked to our rear, slouched over in pain or shame, and a few splashed across the river to their lines, followed by whipping balls. Another rebel regiment attempted to flank around our line, moving down the Harrisburg Road. The 27th Pennsylvania wheeled to face this new threat. A much more daring Confederate officer gallops across the tributary to rally the men in the melee with the Dutch, yelling to his men and waving his saber. However, this bravado immediately vanished as the ironclads in 33rd Massachusetts wheeled about and the officer rode back to his lines, threading the needle between them. The 27th Pennsylvania halted the flanking rebels, wheeling slightly and firing a volley. At the same time, the regiment the rebels were sent up to support surrendered to the Ohioans, who took their colors, torn and blackened by gunpowder. The inscription on the colors read, 9th Louisiana Tiger, when a sudden volley cracked in the rear of his regiment that caught his attention, followed by the screams of both pain and the rebel charge as the gray-clad troops advanced with their long savage bayonets.
The bastards are behind us! Let's give those rebels a fight they won't soon forget! Charge! Push those vagabonds back across the run!
The two regiments clash again in another desperate struggle. An officer slashes the face of a man while a young private attempts to pull a bayonet from his ribs. As men slit throats with bowie knives or grapple, trying to poke each other's eyes out with thumbs, bodies flounder down the red run as flies begin to descend. The wounded roll helplessly in the blood-soaked mud while the savage fight occurs. During the melee, some of the Tigers were able to escape being taken prisoner. Seeing the drastic circumstances, the ironclads moved to the fence behind the melee. The large regiment had trouble maneuvering in the tight space between the cannon, the 33rd Massachusetts, and the melee. Eventually, the 55th Ohio were pushed back and they were forced to retreat, and the regiment eventually was forced to surrender, and our men were taken prisoner and marched behind rebel lines. The ironclad regiment blazed rifle fire into the Confederate regiment, soon followed by the 27th Pennsylvania. The Union prisoners then threw themselves to the ground and crawled back to the bank of the tributary as bullets screamed overhead. To the right of the almshouse, two rebel regiments began to move to the rear of the 33rd Massachusetts, but in doing so came under a heavy fire from the 5th German Rifles, the sheer volume of which halted the two regiments. However, they still opened fire into the 33rd Massachusetts rear to great effect, and men screamed as they fell in bloody heaps. The artillery along the almshouse line jetting huge clouds of smoke. Shells screeched and explosion punctured the air, hammering the ears of the nearby infantry and new gunners. Dilger moves his battery to the right of the field to better shoot at the infantry at the same time. The horses labour under whips as the heavy guns cut ruts into the ground. The rebels make another attempt right at the almshouse as a regiment crosses a tributary. Screaming the rebel yell, their flag trailed huge and bright. Shells landing all around them, their explosions loud and a red glow in the smoke. More shells exploded, throwing up gouts of smoke, dirt, and bodies. The hardtack regiment advanced, their fire crashing into the rebel flank, pouring down the tributary, leaving nowhere to escape. The regiment took cover in the muddy bank as bullets splattered all around them. Some of the men took cover by or on a bridge, cut by bullets, blood seeping into the boards. In front of the almshouse, one of the Confederate regiments, after a melee, withdrew, now isolated to another bayonet charge, while another regiment covered their withdrawal behind a fence in the courtyard while enduring a heavy fire. The regiment struggles to get across the other bank as the Confederate regiment blasts fire across it. However, they eventually find a gap between their regiment and withdraw, but they come under an intense fire. Another rebel regiment suddenly rushes forward, screaming the rebel yell as they come under a heavy fire, made worse by the hardtack regiment which arrived in their flank, ripping more fire into their rank. We advanced to support one of our regiments that broke. One of the Dutch regiments, however, crossed the stream where we came under a thick hail of lead from 3 of their regiments. As the hardtack regiment stops and begins to open fire, the rebel regiment that was withdrawing across the tributary halts to open fire, exposing themselves to the intense fire of the 33rd Massachusetts, creating a corridor of death. However, the 33rd had some of his companies across the tributary, taking fire into their flank and rear. The captain of these companies lay on the ground, his breath bubbling from the wreckage of his rib. Farther down the line, 2 rebel regiments crossed the bridge, but rifle fire from 3 of our regiments checked their advance. One of the rebel regiments had some of their companies across the bridge that were blasted by the 5th German Rifles. The men of Barlow's division arrived on Cemetery Hill in the meantime. The men, bloody and dusty, now instead of exchanging pleasantries with the townfolk, were silent. At the same time, other regiments that were not part of Barlow's division were also withdrawn to the rear. The men now marched through empty streets silently. Looking much like their flags, the men were powder-stained, scorched, bullet-torn, their wounded limping behind them. Some of the men were covered in field dressing or using their rifles as crutches, helped by friends. The most pitiful of all were those who stared and didn't respond to anything, but they did not seem to be wounded at all. Their officer presumed it to be shock. The men gathered on the hill, organized as best they could into columns, as stragglers still came up the hill with horrid wounds, leaving bloody footprints. All the elements of the division were present, except for Barlow himself, who remained by the Gettysburg College, not to report his failure, but in later reports he wrote to stay to observe the defense of the almshouse line, and to withdraw the rest of his division. Choose that across the tributary were now taking extreme casualties as fire poured into their flank and rear. The artillery unleashed a thunderous roar, blanking the battery with smoke, followed by the hellish screech of shells, then an explosion that blasted the Confederate attackers as they attempted to cross the tributary, not making any progress other than to fill it with bodies. The heat grew around the almshouse line as men poured more and more fire on. The men's mouths were salty from the gunpowder, their arms sore from ramming rifles, their lips cracked, their throats burnt, and then their eyes were red and stung in the smoke. The 73rd Ohio moved up by the artillery to support the 33rd Massachusetts. Their ears rang as they got closer to the guns, and their uniforms gathered another layer of powder debris. The rebel regiment attacking on the right side of the almshouse was blasted by the rifle fire with 2 of our regiments into their flank. Then a shell splayed open the belly of a private, his guts and blood poured down his front, and he begged to anybody who would listen, "Just shoot me, for the love of Christ!" This and the fire and turmoil unnerved the regiment so much that it became disorganized and began to fall back. The Confederate attack had stalled up by the almshouse line, unable to make much progress across the tributary. On the left flank, the rebels pushed a regiment to threaten Dilger's battery. Seeing this movement, the men of Segal's regiment moved to check their advance, moving in columns of 4, crushing the wheat in the field to take cover along the fence in front of the battery. As the regiment approached, they attempted to move through the guns, but the gunners halted them as the infantry threatened to eviscerate themselves as they continued to blast the advancing regiment. So the regiment doubled down the row of caissons, completing this tight maneuver around the battery with remarkable discipline, which some of the other regiments would have broken down in confusion. Wheeler's battery, positioned on the road, moved his battery alongside the others on the high ground by the Crawford farm, forming a grand battery which some of the artillery officers reckoned would be familiar to the likes of Napoleon. The building around them was bullet-riddled and scorched by shell fire. A bullet flies high, hitting a skirmisher who dangles out one of the windows, blood dripping from his beard and down the wall. The 73rd Ohio moved to support the 33rd Massachusetts, whose flank had taken severe casualties, and their worried officer believed that they threatened to break, exposing their center. Reports coming into Shirt said that the Union line was holding, as the courier pointed to the defensive positions of the 1st Corps and the small map of the area. Rifle flames glittered in the clouds of smoke as an officer galloped up and down the line, attempting to yell orders over the rifle fire. The blood-soaked field was littered by fly-ridden dead and dying men as a man vomited and another whimpered and screamed. In the acrid smoke and explosions of cartridges, the leftmost companies of the 33rd Massachusetts fell back across the tributaries as bullets splashed around them, putting their regiment in a V shape. Their officer hadn't noticed the disobedience in the clouds of layered powder smoke. However, Smith did, sending the companies back over the tributary. The rebel regiment right of the bridge changed the weight of their fire onto the 5th German Rifles' flank. The men were crudely swept away by the flames of their volley. A sorry few survivors limped back to the town of Gettysburg. The 73rd Ohio arrived on the fence, forming a right angle, pulling back the hammers of the rifles to unleash smoke, sparks, and lead onto the rebels with great effect. Another attack was made by 2 rebel regiments on the right of the almshouse. They advanced, yelping their shrill yells as bugles ripped the sky. The nearby hardtack regiment, seeing this, shuffled back a few paces, and then a cannon blasted 2 shells near them. One threw up great clouds of earth, and another made a short, bright explosion overhead. The solitary rebel regiment made another attack on the left side of our line. They advanced in good orders, their rifles tipped with bayonets that reflected the sun. An explosive shell rained red-hot shrapnel from a black cloud. Segal's regiment advanced in the bread of the tributary, their flag high and flowing in the wind. The men vaulted the fence and moved at the double, descending into the tributary as bullets hummed past, stopping short of the bank to open an angry fusillade on the rat grey mass. By the bridge, the 5th German Rifles took a regular hail of fire, bullets ripping through the air. "Mein Gott! Mein Gott!" their officer repeated, shaking again and again as he fumbled to put percussion caps on his revolver. The rifles took heavy casualties and blood misted the air as bullets hit a man who screamed again and again until it was ended by another rifle shot. Smith ordered the 73rd Ohio to take pressure off the flank of the 33rd Massachusetts. The 73rd Ohio vaulted the fence and advanced as a fusillade whipped and cracked angrily around them. The rebels still held firm in the almshouse. Volleys splintered from the building and bullets thumped into the walls. On the right flank, the hardtack regiment returned to the fence line as the rebel regiment attacked the right were repelled. The 73rd Pennsylvania moved into the center to form a reserve. As they began to march to the center, the fire became too much for the 5th German Rifles and they break and flee. The gunners were petrified, but their battery commander screamed at them to keep firing. However, the gap was a crisis for the officers in the center of the almshouse line.
They have broken! Move your regiment up at once before the rebels take advantage of our weakness and break our line! Yes, sir!
The Madison and Cortland regiments advanced in columns of 4 at the double, vaulting over the fence left of the battery. As the 5th German Rifles retreated, in front of them the worrying advancing troops licked their dry lips with nervousness. As the withdrawing troops streamed past, the 82nd Ohio doubled time to the road, forming line, their officer waving his sword in the air, ordering his men to wheel left and to form alongside the battery, their flag waving in the breeze, being smacked by bullets that cracked overhead. Initially thinking that the Ohioans would arrive first, the men of the Madison and Cortland Regiment halted just behind the artillery battery, whose nearest 2 guns began to fall back. However, as the men of the 82nd approached, the nearby regiments began to fire once again, blocking the regiment's passage to their ranks, causing the regiment to countermarch. The officer of the Madison and Cortland Regiment, seeing this, ordered his column forward once again to vault over the fence. The guns were formed on the road, supported by the 82nd, who formed a reserve nearby them. However, the men of the Madison and Cortland Regiment hesitated, and their officer ordered his men forward once again into line where the 5th German Rifles once were, marked by their fly-ridden bodies. The men screamed and cursed as they twitched as they were hit. A man crawled across the ground, leaving a trail of blood. In the center of our line, the rebels continued their struggle in the almshouse. Dead skirmishers hang out the windows and blood ran down the walls. As the regiment holds the courtyard behind a fence,
"Blast them rogues!"
yells one of their officers. The men behind the fence curse our clumsiness as they attempt to rip open paper cartridges, spitting bullets down barrels, then shoving ramrods down the barrels, scrambling for percussion caps. Despite the 2 other regiments being pushed back, the rebels pushed 2 large regiments to attack into the killing patch on the extreme left flank of our line, their flags and bayonets bright. Segal's regiment advances their line into the tributary, however the center companies could not see the enemy. The crackling rifle fire from Segal's regiment's flanking companies and the 2 other regiments nearby led the rebels to withdraw. Their banner fell to be snatched up again, only to fall again as their new bearer was thrown back by a dozen bullets. One of the Confederate officers looked stone-faced over the crumbling attack by the bridge, silently holding his field glasses at his chest. The larger regiment rushed to an officer who was at risk of being captured in his position. On the right side of the bridge, a rebel regiment held the line behind a fence. Bullets cracked by, and so the regiment stood in a bloody heap of writhing bodies. The majority of Confederate units were concentrated around the orchard of the almshouse. Bullets scattered the trees as regiments shuffled forward to make new attacks, while other regiments withdrew to the rear despite nearby officers calling for them to reform. Men rushed out from the almshouse with open crates of ammunition or to collect wounded, leaving trails of blood to the almshouse where moans were heard, where men waited to be dressed and sent to the rear. To put more pressure on the almshouse and to block the Harrisburg Road, the 134th New York advanced parallel to the road, rushing over the fence and following their officer with his kepi on his sword. Right side of the bridge, the rebels again crossed the bridge with a few companies, sustaining terrific fire from our nearby regiments. Their entire front of their regiment disappeared in a cloud of powder smoke. Following a fugitive regiment, a rebel officer saw a smaller regiment on their right flank was beginning to fall back and rode over to them to rally them.
Hold hard, boys! Hold hard!
He yelled, lifting his sword in the air as his horse reared. A courier galloped over to Church, handing him a report that Robinson's forces were holding on Oak Ridge despite being pushed back from their initial position and held firm in the wood line. Cutler sent his brigade to move in to attack the rebel flank in the wheat field. Another report read that on McPherson's Ridge, despite being outnumbered, the men of Iverson's brigade were being pushed back by the men of the Western Iron Brigade, taking cover in the recently captured railway cut, by great effect by the guns of Hall's battery blasting canister into the rebel attackers. On the Almshouse line, the rebel attack on the left flank of the bridge was being halted in the semicircle of our regiments that erupted with rifle fire. On the left flank, a rebel regiment withdrew behind us, and thinking that it was another attack, an officer was about to send an order to the 136th New York to about face and fire, but seeing that the men were in no place to reorganize, a report was sent to Major General Alfred Pleasanton to send a cavalry patrol to find them later on in the battle. The almshouse, burnt and scarred from the hard fighting around it. In his courtyard was a mound of bloody, writhing bodies. The regiment halted to form another ring of fire around the almshouse. A sergeant slumped over the fence, blood dripping from his dangling hands. Von Arnsberg in the meantime sent a courier to the Madison and Cortland regiment, informing them that they were now detached from his brigade officially, and planned to make another attack on the rebels. The artillery officers along the line looked through their field glasses and telescopes at the effect of their batteries. A shell exploded among the rebel ranks, throwing them to great heights. Dull thuds came from down the battery as it jetted smoke from its barrels, easily blasting the closely gathered Confederate regiments to great effect. This battery once again moved their guns forward to the high ground by the Crawford farm with the other batteries. The gunners grunted and swearing under the weight of their great guns. The combat continued, sounding like storm clouds heaving great thunderclaps. From filthy, leopardous yellow clouds of smoke came metallic clatter of ramrods, followed by the flames of rifles spearing through the smoke. A private was flung back with a saw-shaped hole in his skull, splattering his neighbor with blood, who stood transfixed as his body slid to a halt at his feet, the body twitching as blood poured from the shattered cranium. A young man, no more than a boy, loaded and primed his rifle, pulling the trigger, and after nothing happened, he loaded and primed it again, risking bursting the barrel until a sergeant slapped the weapon out of his hand and handed him a bloody rifle from a dead man. The 33rd Massachusetts, after taking such severe casualties on his left flank, began to lose order and fall back. Seeing this, Smith, who was nearby, raised his saber in the air and screamed at his men to reform and to return to the fence line. The regiment obeyed and followed their banner, a nearly black rag at this point, to the fence line again. The regiment at this point was torn into a bloody half, which continued their dogged defense of the fence line with 50% casualties. On the right of the Almshouse line, another rebel regiment advanced alone, cheering, screaming, and swearing at the Union soldiers in an almost feral, battle-crazed excitement, following their bullet-torn Blue Cross flag and their brass-screaming bugles. The men felt blows like kicks from horses as blood spread across their front. Voices called out for water as bullets ripped overhead. An officer rode along their ranks, encouraging their men,
"Give them a good volley, men! For the Union boys!"
As they crossed the tributary, men were careful to keep their rifles and muskets over their head. Men who were hit splashed into the water, then the regiment disappeared out of view as they suddenly appeared on the other bank, and fire cut down a few men on their leftmost companies. The regiment then took cover in the bank, steadying their rifles on it and unleashing a rugged volley that flayed our troops. A minion ball speared the throat of one of their captains, splashing their comrades with blood. On the left, seeing that the 33rd was being cut to pieces by rebel fire, the officer of the 73rd Pennsylvania advanced his regiment to relieve them. Men involuntarily ducked as bullets cracked overhead. The regiment was still in line. Slowed by this, the officer quickly ordered them into column and yelled at his men to continue their advance. The artillery whipped shell after shell into the thinning line of graybacks. Explosions crunched and shrapnel flew, blasting full companies apart. On the left of the Almshouse line, a small rebel regiment was rallied and, accompanied by one of their officers, advanced with a cheer that swept through the thick smoke.
"Come on, boys, for your homes and for your hearts!"
Seeing this, the officer of Segal's regiment ordered them across the tributary to pour infilade fire on them as he attacked. The men pulled back their hammers and leveled their rifles, firing a shattering volley. As the rebel attack was now being focused around the bridge, Krasnowski rode there to oversee the defense. The 33rd Massachusetts fought like demons, unleashing withering fire. However, the premonition of the 73rd Pennsylvania officer was correct, and the 33rd Massachusetts broke as the Pennsylvanians were halfway to relieving them. With his sword in the air, he ordered his column forward at the double to the fence line, grotesque with the bodies of the Bay statesmen. As the regiment rushed forward, surrounding it, the usual cacophony of battle was heard. An officer screaming orders to his men as bullets cracked past, the noise of bullets smacking wooden walls and rifle stocks, the clang of bullets striking canteens. The screams and gasps of wounded and dying as bullets thumped into flesh. Shells wailed overhead and bullets cracked, slapping and tearing at their colors. On the right of the Almshouse line, the solitary rebel regiment suffered immense casualties, then a bugle blared out as the 27th Pennsylvania charged.
Look, men, they are badly bloodied! Push them back across the tributary! For God und für Naten Staten! Charge!
The 27th Pennsylvania charged forth, their eyes almost ablaze with rage and their savage bayonets pointed forward. As the regiments clashed, men stabbed each other through the fence. The fight was hard and fierce, but soon the savage rebels were flung back across the tributary. The 27th Pennsylvania advanced to take cover along the bridge, and they were soon followed by the ironclads, resting their rifles along the fence and slammed a volley into the courtyard of the almshouse, their rifle flames spearing bright through the smoke. By the bridge, another attempt to cross the tributary was made, as one of the officers yells, "Fix bayonets, boys, and scream, for God's sake, scream!" But it was drowned out by musket and cannon fire. In the attack, the regiment's officer reeled out of ranks, blood pouring from his eye socket. Seeing this, the attack quickly fell apart, and the regiment quickly splashed back across the tributary and retreated. One of the large regiments turned and fired, their missiles hissing through the smoke into the left flank of the rebel regiment on the bridge. Farther down the line, Segal's regiment crossed into the tributary to flank the rebels who gathered by the bridge. They were careful to keep their rifles above the water to keep their powder dry as they advanced. A small rebel regiment fired sporadically at them as they advanced, but having little effect, the bullets whipping overhead, so the large regiment ignored them. Seeing their predicament, the guns of Dilger's battery thundered, unleashing screaming shells that cracked overhead. Flames continued to blast down the tributary into the rebel ranks as men threw their insults at each other. "Had enough, Johnny? Go home, crowd, before I send you home in a box!" A rebel ammunition wagon trundled down the Harrisburg Road. The cover of the wagon was torn by bullets, and the driver ducking and flinching every time a bullet cracked by, praying that nothing would hit the cartridges behind him, or else the wagon and everything surrounding it would go up in a giant fireball. As the driver went down the road, he squinted in the thick cloud of powder smoke. As soon as the driver realized he approached the Union line once again, the driver then pulled on the reins, turning the wagon around. Our men responded with jeers and rifle fire, hoping to create a huge obstacle disorganizing the next rebel attack. Our men slammed a volley into the wagon, bruising their shoulders, flinching men back with the force of bullets. The officer of the 134th New York was certain that the eruption of fire meant that the rebels were making another attack and advanced on the bank of the tributary. In the center, a rebel officer oversaw the crumbling attack as shells exploded all around them. The smell of blood was thick in the air as bodies littered the ground. A man gasped, "Jesus!" over and over again in the bank of the tributary. On the right flank, the Hardtack Regiment moved to the bank as more rebel regiments moved down the Harrisburg Road. The men looked at the new attackers, senses overwhelmed by the smoke, their shoulders hurting from the recoil of their rifles, loading and ramming another powder charge down their hot-fouled barrels and putting another percussion cap on their cones. Von Armsburg looked down the line as the few rebel regiments defended the orchard. By the college, Schurz looked through his field glasses and saw that the almshouse line held, but the regiment still rushed past him. He believed they were returning to the fight, but they were in panic. They got lost in the city and ran back to the almshouse line. Despite this, Schurz rode up to the cemetery hill to report his success to Howard. To the right of the almshouse line, the rebels make another attack with a nearly fresh brigade of troops.
Moving over the rail and plank fences and crossing the creek, I knew at this moment our attack would be the last chance to push back the Dutch Corps. The men must have known it too as they rushed to the enemy with a resolution and spirit rarely excelled.
The rebel regiments advanced on our right in one last great onslaught in a column led by one of their officers on foot in a fury unparalleled to that point. All sound was obliterated by the great cheer and thumping of 100 boots, easily drowning out the snaps of rifle fire. Shells exploded overhead, creating instant black clouds of smoke, slapping metal fragments into the ground and tearing flesh. Von Armsburg's brigade waits in the rear, their flank slapped by high-flying bullets as they prepare a counterattack should their flank be pushed back. Von Armsburg sends a courier to the 82nd Ohio to support the defense on the right, and the advancing columns of four, their flags streaming forward. As the rebels extend their line, the guns of Weidrich's battery flung back, sending shell upon shell, screeching, bursting smoke, fire, and metal fragments into the column. On the left flank, the 33rd Massachusetts retreated past Dilger's battery despite the gunners' warnings that they approached the rebel lines. The rebel attack seemed to be breaking down at the mere threat of Segal's regiment attacking on their right flank. Troops to their left broke, scattering like barnyard fowl, and to their front a regiment moved back as they reformed. While the troops on the bridge took murderous fire, they made a fighting withdrawal. On the right of the almshouse line, the attack continued, led not by an officer but by their ammunition wagon that once again was lost in the smoke and chaos of battle.
Forward, boys! Get that fool with our ammunition back here at once! Where the hell am I? The smoke is too thick! Oh God! It's the Union line!
The rebels eventually pull back their ammunition wagon, but all the yelling attracts the attention of rifle and shell fire that causes many casualties. A salvo of shells crashes into the dirt in front of the regiment and blasted the officer and standard bearer into the air. They fell like broken rag dolls for the men to quickly snatch up their standard again and continue their advance. A young private screamed on, punctuated by gasps as he was dragged away by a bandsman, leaving a trail of blood. At the same time, the 27th Pennsylvania were pulled back as their ranks got in the way of two regiments on their flanks. On the left flank, the final regiment of rebels were pushed back. The fugitives ducked involuntarily as a shell screamed low overhead, ricocheting and exploding shrapnel in their faces. And a man fell with a monstrous blow to his shoulder and collapsed with an astonished look on his face as he caught one. Another bullet speared a man's neck and it gushed with blood as he fell to the ground with a scream. Seeing the attack on the left was being so stubborn, von Amsburg moves the rest of his brigade to the extreme right flank to attack the rebels to sweep down their line. While the maelstrom in the orchard continues, bullets slice through the air, scarring the trees as men load and fire until their rifles become so fouled by powder that it becomes painful to reload them. The dead and wounded lay alongside discarded ammunition containers and a hat filled with percussion caps. Farther down the left flank, a Union supply wagon was recalled to our side of the tributary, having been lost in the wave of fugitives and smoke in the retreat from the Knoll. Dilger's battery, after causing such extreme damage to the rebel attackers on the left flank, was called to the right flank of the Union line. A man was thrown back as a piece of shrapnel hit his head, spraying his neighbors with blood. Then their leading regiments formed into line, sergeants ordering their men to close the bloody gaps as they fired a blistering volley on our troops. Our troops responded likewise, following their training on instinct, firing as fast as they possibly could. Rifle flames speared through the smoke with short, sharp cracks as men ran bullets onto powder charges. While the 11th Corps held the line by the almshouse, Robinson's forces on Oak Ridge were being pushed back, and so von Amsburg's fresh brigade was moved to the left flank to support them via the Mummersburg Road. As the men marched, they kicked up large clouds of dust, causing their eyes to become red and their faces were streaked with sweat. The men have terrified thoughts of becoming wounded and prayed for protection as they had not yet faced combat in this battle so far. At the same time, the 82nd of Ohio arrived on the right flank of the line and moved to support the flank of the hardtack regiment. The rebel ammunition wagon was still caught between the two sides. The driver slouched in his seat to avoid being shot. Bullets zipped through the air, cutting through the cloth of the covered wagon. As the Confederate attacks on the left stalled, they moved their artillery onto the knoll to support them. Our regiments then wheeled to open a sheet of flame along the bank of the tributary, smoke from which hangs over it like an early morning mist. Biting off bullets, pouring the gritty powder down hot barrels, and spitting the bullets that sizzled down their blackened barrels, followed by clattering ramrods, then turning the rifle upright, putting a percussion cap on their rifle cones and firing, wincing at the hard recoil that contacted their bruised shoulders. The rebel gunners opened a lively fire, and shells exploded like fireworks on the 4th of July. In response, 3 batteries on our left flank were ordered to fire upon them. Shells screeched overhead and eviscerated the team horses of one of the guns, 50 paces away. The horses screamed as they flailed bloodily on the ground, scaring the others. The Confederate attack on the right had halted in our crackling rifle fire and pulsating brilliantly in the smoke. A colonel pacing up and down his regiment yelled to his men to be heard over the rifle fire, "The bastards are breaking, boys! Keep up the fire! Keep up that fire!" The 82nd continued to make their way to the flank of the line, the men's throats thickened by powder smoke. Advancing to put more fire on the rebels, the 27th Pennsylvania rested in the rear, ready to move up to support the line. The Confederate officer leading the attack galloped from regiment to regiment of his brigade, shouting encouraging words to them. "Lick 'em good, boys! Lick 'em some bitches good and hard!" Bullets slice all around, ending in explosions of pains and screams as blasting, splintering volleys continue over the tributary. As the men of the left flank withdrew, Segal's regiment was ordered back across the tributary once again. At the same time, Dilger's battery and Segal's sharpshooters moved to the right flank. On the right flank, the rebels extended their line by a regiment to match our own regiments along the tributary. Seeing this maneuver, Weidrich's battery blasted the regiment. Cannonballs tear down their ranks, shattering the fence that created deadly splinters that flew down the ranks, impaling the men. The 82nd Ohio lined up on the fence to shoot over the heads of other regiments, and so the 27th Pennsylvania formed on their left to do the same thing. The officers yelled encouragement to their men, their mouths dry and hoarse so it was hard to talk, emptying their rifle and revolver cartridges into the thick powder smoke. "Goddamn bastards! Goddamn rebel bastards!" A sergeant growled as he bit into another paper cartridge. On the left flank, Segal's regiment withdrew across the tributary, the small rebel regiment firing another scattered volley to little effect, many of the bullets whipsawing high. On Oak Hill, Robinson's forces began to push back the rebels, taking cover in the tree line as best they could as they poured heavy rifle fire into the Confederate attackers. Along the almshouse line, all was quiet except for the guns blasting the attack on the right flank. On the right flank of the almshouse line, the murderous fight continues, as shouts of men can barely be heard over the rifle fire as bodies continue to pile up on the banks of the tributary. The battlefield was ungodly hot, and the men by now had drained their canteens of its tepid contents. Some of the men scrabbled amongst the dead for canteens that had some of its precious contents left. Men bit paper cartridges with powder-blackened lips, followed by metallic clatter as they rammed their charges home, pulling back their heavy hammers that clicked, priming them, then firing. The volley then exploded, throwing men back. On the left flank, Segal's sharpshooters were moved farther down the line as they moved to form a position to rally by Krasnowski, but then were ordered back to the fence line. On the left side of the almshouse line, they looked over the litters of wounded and dead. On the right flank, Dilger's battery arrived to support the defense line lining up on the road. The battery fired a salvo, and an ear-splitting roar as shells flew overhead. As a man screamed as he was hit in the leg, and another staggered to the rear, holding his stomach, blood seeping through his fingers. On the extreme left, von Armsburg's fresh brigade marched down the road to arrive on the Oak Ridge. The brigade threw up great clouds of dust that did not help the men who were already dehydrated. The attack on the left flank ground to a stalemate as many balls twitched the surviving rebels, pushing them back. A private nearly whimpered as he felt a sharp blow to his hip, then wetness down his thigh, but it was his canteen being burst by a mini-ball, and not him being hit. As the 27th Pennsylvania moved farther down the left flank, they could not shoot above their fellow regiments from the side of the road. The 82nd Ohio was moving along the bank of the tributary to pour flanking fire that slashed the rebel attackers, pouring lead into the gun smoke. As the Pennsylvanians advanced to the left, the rebel fire became feebler, and most of them began to withdraw. On Cemetery Hill, Howard read some disturbing reports that the men on McPherson's Ridge were beginning to be pushed back. The men bit cartridges, spat bullets, poured powder, and rammed the charge down hard, upending their rifles to press the percussion caps on their cones, pulling their heavy triggers as fast as they were able. On the left flank, the three batteries were ordered by Osborne to fire on the rebel cannon on the knoll. As another battery of rebel guns arrived on the knoll, shells screamed all around them. As the rebel battery unlimbered, they opened a lively fire, and their shot and shell ricocheted splendidly over the open fields. A cannonball flew, shattering the head of a private who froze for a fraction of a second, then fell. On the right flank, a rebel regiment reorganized by their commanding officer, who emptied his cylinder of his revolver into the cloud of smoke. At the same time, the fire became too much for one of our regiments, who took heavy casualties. Men fell screaming and bleeding, calling out in pain, and so were rushed back to the fence. Men limped back across the fence line, some with field dressing stained brown. Bones flew as a man was hit in the ribs, as a fragment of his bones cut the men nearest to him. The man fell twitching, blood flooding from his shattered chest as he tried to say something to his shock file partners, but he choked on the blood and died. Their officers soon took up rifles as their revolvers had little effect. One called to the man next to him for a cartridge, who responded by gasping when a bullet struck him. As bullets cracked all around, a man discarded his rifle as the heat caused the firing cone of his rifle to become brittle and break. The men felt stings of bullets, benumbed by pain, causing an instant metamorphosis from strength and vigor to helplessness. Soon they were surrounded by the bloody bodies of dead and dying on the blood-soaked ground. The 134th New York were the first to withdraw, suffering from the same problem as the 27th and worsened by the rebel fire. To the right, the hardtack regiment also surges back to the fence line, one soldier writing, "We suffered severely from the enemy batteries and musketry as we withdrew." A man's arm, hanging bloodily, attempted to load his rifle one-handed as blood ran down its barrel. The 82nd wheels to pour flanking fire on the attacking rebels should they attack again. The 134th and hardtack regiment then faced the rebels, prepared for another rebel attack. However, the rebels held their ground as they faced large amounts of casualties and had no reserve to press the attack, and so once again the battlefield was eerily silent except for the booming of cannon in the artillery duel, punctuated by the screams and moans of wounded and dying. Sweat stung the eyes of the men, faces as black as chimney sweeps, and eyes reddened by the powder as they looked over the horror of the dead. They were piled in every shape, some on their backs, some on their faces, and others turned and twisted in every imaginable shape. Then the rebel attack was forced back. The legendary division of Stonewall Jackson was beaten, and Chancellorsville was avenged.
Now I shall be trapped in this herb of barbarism forever! Where am I? Looks like I found myself in an era of even more depravity than the last place in time. Someone is coming. Better hide the machine.
Who's
the worst speech I have ever heard. The babbling walruses of the Iris of Sky are more coherent.
Malish? Looks like he's gone off to bed then.
Is this really supposed to be the man who is to best the king in battle? If so, he must have snuck up on him somehow. Clearly we must send some of our best agents to act as advisors, as these people are far more backward than we thought. Wait, more people coming?
Sir, I brought you your armor as you requested from the armory. I guess he's still sleeping. Best to get his mother then.
God, how many more of these people will arrive? Edmund?